In the early 1980s, personal computers were new and intimidating. And what was most intimidating about them in many ways was that the dominant company was IBM. Apple, which was a fledgling company at that time, headed up by Steve Jobs, launched a commercial that completely changed the game. And that commercial was based on the people's fears of the world turning into the kind of dystopian future that was portrayed in the novel 1984, George Orwell's novel 1984. And it portrayed a large group of automatons, people who were completely brainwashed, watching a large Big Brother figure on a screen, and a woman wearing an Apple t-shirt running through and destroying what was on the screen by slinging a hammer at it. The commercial was the foundation of Apple's success. It then became, it then morphed later into the Apple versus PC ads of the 1990s and 2000s. And the point of it all was to tell people that computers could be friendly to users, and they didn't have to be as intimidating as IBM was presenting them. So where did that come from? Well, that came from insight. It came from the insight that people were afraid of computers. And so what Apple was able to do was to create a computer that people were less afraid of, and where it wasn't going to go wrong and you had to reprogram everything. And that's what insight is all about. It's making that leap into the unknown, because nobody knew what would happen if you started to play up people's fears, and building an innovation on top of it. In design, there's a classic model called the double diamond model. That is where you go from observations to insights, and we'll talk more about insights in a moment, to confirming those insights into design principles, and then to solutions. And so in this lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about what insights are, where they come from, and how they get translated into design principles, which ultimately are your pathway to solutions. Insight and empathy are absolutely intertwined. Insight, then, there's a number, if you look at the dictionary, you'll find a number of different meanings for insight. Insight is a piece of information that might be significant. It's the act or result of apprehending the inner nature of things, or of seeing intuitively. The power of acute observation and deduction, penetration, discernment, or perception, or introspection, looking within yourself for some quality that is elusive. So you could take that insight about personal computers, that personal computers are scary, and what was really, I think, so significant about Apple's idea was that they saw that, and that they saw that it was significant, and they saw that it was the kind of thing they might be able to build a business on. What they were doing was empathizing with the fears that consumers have. And empathy is the capacity to recognize or understand someone else's state of mind or emotion, put oneself in their shoes, or to see or in some way experience the outlook or emotions of another being within oneself. So here, insight in design is about users and other stakeholders, and it can lead to some very powerful ideas. And here are some examples. I've talked in other lectures about the Got Milk campaign, and the behavioral insight there is around milk being an essential companion to some foods. And so the general question is, are there, around your product category, are there interesting, quirky thoughts or attitudes or behaviors that make people tick? And in this case, yeah, you had to have milk with your cereal. And so that became an insight that was the foundation of a great advertising campaign. Business insight. Is there some kind of weakness that we might have and make it a strength? So Lakehead University, which you may know is in Thunder Bay, Ontario, is pretty far from, well, just about everything. And so what Lakehead University was able to do was to pitch their campus as being a truly Canadian experience. You were out in the wilderness. And that has concrete results. That means that if you're doing things like forestry programs, it seems to be the place to do it, or mining programs, et cetera, et cetera. Category insight. Could you see this category as something different? So Newfoundland and Labrador tourism it's a great destination, Newfoundland and Labrador, but it's not just about where you're going. It's not just about beauty shots and pictures and so on, but it's creating something that is an escape. Because what Newfoundland Tourism realized was that people want to get away from the day-to-day once a year or twice a year or whatever. And so to create another world in their advertising that really portrayed something different from what they would ever experience. So it was about where you're coming from as much as it is where you're going. Product insights. Are there some pain points that we can build on? And of course, the airlines like Southwest Airlines, WestJet have built themselves on this more friendly model of service, which is really as a counterpoint to the dissatisfaction that people feel with the larger airlines, Air Canada, United, American Airlines, and so on. So it's this kind of small, friendly feel that can appeal to a large segment of consumers. And then brand insight, we actually used a bit of a brand insight in when we were designing the UVic MBA, so that we knew that as a school, we're pretty unique, that we have a very clear set of values around sustainability and community development and so on. And that's very much in the DNA of Gustafson. So the question then was, is that something where we could share that with potential students? And that was how the UVic MBA came about, which is this idea the future is not optional, but the idea that we could create a truly authentic MBA that dealt with sustainability. And there's an example of the advertising that we used, and what we were trying to communicate here was that we weren't just talking sustainability, but we were actually doing it. So this was very much that we were really staking our flag on the ground. Where other business schools might have a sustainability option, we didn't have an option. As far as we were concerned, all business should be about sustainability, and we wanted to plant that flag. An insight, though, it's more than an observation. It might arise from an observation, but it becomes a creative leap. So if you take a simple fact, people feed their pets, or they tend to feed their pets twice a day. And if you were to do some observation on that, and to sit in homes with people and watch what they do with their pets, they tend to feed them at meal times. They tend to feed them at breakfast time and dinner time. So the empathy that comes out of that is, well, what does it feel like to own a pet? As you're watching all of this, you start to think about, okay, what do the owners feel as they're going? And the insight here is they're feeding people at mealtimes. So at the same time the pet is having its food, which it often finishes very quickly, the humans are having their food too, and they start to feel guilty because they're eating in front of their pets. And so there's a bit of an insight there, and you wonder, is there some sort of way you could launch either a product or a service that would, or even an app that reminds people to feed their pets just before dinner or whatever, so that you can sort of deal with the guilt. So an insight around attitude and psychology that might be very useful there. Here are some things you might ask yourself as you're going through your research. What makes you curious? What kind of things are really sort of popping out and intriguing you? What might differ from what your expectations? Maybe people are doing things that are ingenious and you don't know why. So maybe finding out what that is. A great example would be the Harley-Davidson motorcycle sound. So what was happening for a long time was that Harley-Davidson users were adjusting their bikes. So their timing would be slightly off, so they would make this loud noise. And in seeing that, Harley-Davidson thought, oh, well, maybe we can make a noisier bike just by having slightly different timing specifications. So, little things like that, watching users and watching their behavior can give you great insights. What might be done? I mean, that might, adjusting your bike in that sense so the timing is off makes it, less fuel efficient, but in another way, it makes it more noisy and more fun. What are users assuming? What are they maybe assuming that they're not talking about, but seems significant to you? And then, what can you see in their behavior, how they're relating to each other? How do they look affectionately at their phone? What is going on that they can see or feel or hear And within all of those, there might be an insight that you can use. Once you've developed an insight, the idea then is to move that into design principles. I actually call design principles insight-based design principles, because what you really are doing is trying to represent a pathway to your design by stating some of the key things that you found that your design needs to conform to. Tight enough to keep your thinking focused, but open enough to allow you to reframe. So on the right of the screen, an example: minimize the pain. This is for interfaces. No one likes filling in forms. Smart defaults, inline validation, forgiving inputs. Just make it easy. Illuminating a path to completion. Consider the context. Is it familiar versus foreign? Is it frequently used versus rarely used? Ensure that communication is consistent. What happens when there are errors, and so on. So I'm going to give you an example of a project that we worked on in Nepal some years ago. And this was about rural healthcare in Nepal. And this was a team of design students, and they came up with 6 design principles. And what they wanted to do was to just lay out, they did research, and then they laid out what came out from that research for them in the form of insight-based design principles. The first of those was the solutions should consider the role of women in rural cultures, being sensitive to the social implications of absence of men in communities. So Nepal, like a lot of South Asian countries, has an issue with migration or migrant laborers. So a lot of them go to the Middle East to work in construction projects, and that leaves the villages short of men. So they're mostly women in the villages, and so they run the show. And so when you're developing a design principle, there's an insight there, right? That's a social insight. So having that as one of the things that you need to take into account as you're developing things that would improve healthcare in rural areas is a really important thing. Another one: examine and address the basic unmet needs of rural healthcare workers in Nepal. So a lot of the problem was not at the patient end, but was actually at the service delivery end for the workers. Provide desirable challenges for healthcare workers. Consider and overcome infrastructural barriers. So Nepal is a very, very poor country, and physically a very challenging country to navigate your way around because of the mountains and very few roads. So being able to overcome those, be a system of services focused around effective communication, and be sensitive to the specific culture and ideologies of rural areas. So in other words, the idea here is to reflect your research in your design principles. They shouldn't come out of nowhere, and they should really be, in particular, reflecting any interesting behavioral insights or observational insights that you came up with in your research. A few points to remember as we finish this one. Good insights, they really are an aha moment when you start to see the inner nature of things, and they arise from empathy. And what you're trying to do with design principles is bring this empathy into your design. What is not effective for design principles is, it has to cost this much, or it has to fit within our factory and that. I mean, those are all givens, right? That you need those. But what you need to do is to build on that. In other words, design principles are not constraints on design. What they are is opportunities to build on empathy that you have with users. They're guideposts to the solution, and they kind of fill that gap in intuition between understanding needs and then having a magical leap of intuition about solutions. So there is magic in design, and that magic comes through this process of developing insights and turning those into design principles.